So when I was a kid, I had these reoccurring nightmares. I kept dreaming that Santa Claus and the devil got together and they would wheel me around on a hand truck and try to give me blood tests in my toes. When did they ever since these seasons come and go? I was in terror on the 25th.
They joined forces with a coterie of adventurous music lovers, simultaneously gathering in Pasadena around Tom Recchion and Booga Records. This was a scene of misfits and musical anarchists that also included smegma. Within a few years, LAFMS had become an umbrella organization for the groups La Forte 4, the Duets, Ace and Deuce, and Airway, among many others. As the record label behind the compilations Pleur Bassett, Plug, Crad, and Darker Scratcher, LAFMS also became a point of contact for a number of significant figures in the U.S. underground. It's true that LAFMS is best known for making experimental music, musique concrète, aleatory music, free improv, noise, and other stuff that defies categorization. But their records also contain a bewildering array of pop music styles: crowd rock, jazz, new wave, songs that sound like TV music, songs that sound like the Monroe Brothers, songs that sound like Art Denny, even a cover of Boris the Spider. Two rock bands made up of LAFMS members, Human Hands and Bee People, became part of yet another local conglomerate, Associated Skull Bands, which included Nervous Gender, Monitor, and Non. 5 years ago, the exhibition Beneath the Valley, the Lowest Form of Music at the Box marked LAFMS's 40th anniversary. The new 13-disc set, LAFMS Box Box, contains recordings from every performance that took place during the show's run. Joining us today to talk about it are Ace Farren Ford, Dennis Duck, Paul McCarthy, Joe Potts, Rick Potts, Tom Recchion, Vetza, and Mitchell Brown. Fellow citizens, please welcome these visitors from the future, the 2016 LA Free Music Society. So first things first, since this is commemorating the release of the box set and it's 5 years on since the box show, I wonder if you could all share some thoughts and memories of that 6-week gallery show.
I don't remember. That's why we did the box. It sort of happened organically. I mean, there was this exhibition here in LA at the Box was kind of a reprise of a show that we did in London, which featured a lot of the same stuff. But when we did it there, Paul saw it. He was a participant in it and thought it would be a good idea to mount the same thing here in LA. But since this is home turf, we had all our archives at our disposal, so we just sort of decided to, bring everything out of the closets and garages and basements, and it kind of was surprising to see how much detritus there actually was from all the work we've done over the years, and it took shape in the box.
I was going to mention that playing music, improvisational music, and speaking use two completely different parts of your brain. So that was part of it. It's a hard transition to go from playing to talking, so maybe this was a huge mistake. But
Our career was kind of built on that.
yeah. But the box show was even sort of overwhelming to me, even though I was, a deep participant of it. But so I'm glad it kind of got wrangled into this box. But the opening performance was really memorable. Even though we had all agreed not to play the first night, we did anyway, and I guess that was a really good thing. But all the shows were great, and it was really amazing to see all of everything that we'd done kind of all put in one place for the first time. It was overwhelming.
One of the things is that our show was the first show at the Box's new space, and they were kind of building the space around us as we were installing it. And so we didn't have a lot of time to mount the show, and so, a few days before the show, everything just kind of appeared. We all cleaned out our garages and stuff, and all of a sudden there were these piles of things that had to be arranged, and so, it was basically a spontaneous improvisation as far as most of the installation goes. I mean, the box staff did the traditional installation of the, more traditional art, but the stuff on the tables and stuff was just kind of thrown together in an improvised manner.
I met Tom and Fredrik and maybe Joe in the early 70s because my studio was underneath Ooga, and Ooga was at one point Pasadena, Old Town Pasadena was primarily a kind of art colony. Probably 150 artists lived in Pasadena. And at one point, the LA Free Press was there, and a number of other organizations and all that stuff. And Ooga was a hip record store. At that time, it was in the Oddfellows Temple, which was later torn down and became Parsons. But then throughout the years, I knew. And I was part of other music groups, but throughout the years I knew people connected to the LAFMS, and then I sort of become part of it. I don't know when, I have no idea. But when there was a show in Norway, we did a thing in Norway, and at that time I was playing with LAFMS and with Mike Kelly, and Mike Kelly and I had a group called Saudi Sock. And so both of them played, and then Mike at that point joined extended organ. And it maybe was the first, at that point we made a sculpture that we auctioned off or donated, which was an organ with dildos placed on the keys or something. And we kind of, had a raffle and somebody won it. And it was in some ways, like an exit. I think maybe before London came Norway. And Norway was, at that point, a lot of photographs were shown and sculptures were shown that the LAF had made. Then a few years later, London happens, and then the box had happened. And I think at that point, what was somewhat critical is that although, that the LAFMS as an organization had never really been, why hadn't an exhibition of the LAFMS ever happened? And why hadn't the organization, which made up so many music improvisational groups, never really been, in some ways, recognized by any organization in LA. It was a puzzle to me. Why didn't the Getty buy the archive? Why didn't, if an organization that spanned 40 years and so much had been made and so much had been done, that it seemed at that point critical that like a thing like the box can put something out there, and then maybe somebody else with more, power or something, or money or whatever, can pick up on it. It becomes the reason for, I think, these kinds of, more like this place here, so it just seemed like, let's just do the show, and maybe something generates either through another organization, a museum or something, or, so I think that was, the impetus was, why the fuck hasn't it happened?
We've always considered ourselves a disorganization. And there were plenty of times where the group was invited to participate in various compilations or situations, and we just didn't have it together to make that happen. I would find letters that were 4 years old and go, geez, why didn't I respond to that? And, so we were organized locally, but globally we weren't reaching out there in the way that we probably should have been. But we did a ton of work and performed all over the city and released over 14 independent records, numerous singles, lots of publications and concerts and flyers, and this was all before the punk era, and also concurrent to all that. But it's a struggle in a city that didn't have a real active experimental music scene like it does now. We had very few options of where to play and where to present the work. And sometimes where we would play, we would not be received very well. So, but we kept looking for new resources and new opportunities. We had to make them happen.
Well, sorry, go ahead, Vetza.
You were talking about not having the opportunity because there weren't the places. For me, this was coming home, kind of a haven, because I came from music to this scene, and there weren't a lot of venues for real experimental music in this city, and everyone kept telling me, you need to go to New York, but I want to stay warm. So I stayed. I had the pleasure of meeting Joe very early on in the 70s, and so I was coming from a musical background of improvisation into this, which allowed me to do what I wanted to do. So for me, it was unlike what you were saying, Tom, about not feeling like there was enough to do. For me, coming into this music art scene was finding places where I could get to do whatever it was that I wanted to do, because it was, free improv and there were no parameters. So the disorganization was actually a gift for me. So it's been a pleasure. It's been since the 70s, and it keeps moving and growing, and I hope I'm here till I croak. It's fantastic, and then with the box supporting us the way they did, it was, it just continues. The work has continued to grow, which is wonderful.
Well, that relates to something else I wanted to ask you about, which is, you're sort of already addressing it, but how do you think being from Los Angeles affected the sensibilities of the group? I mean, beyond the opportunities for where to play and the differences between the scenes, I would think the difference between here and New York is kind of obvious in a lot of ways, but I wonder if there are other things about coming from LA or the way the city is arranged that have affected your career.
Well, LA is pretty isolated, so especially back then, there was other interesting music happening around the city, experimental music, but we didn't know about it a lot of times. I mean, through Cal Arts, we knew some people, but there were other people doing interesting things, but you just didn't really hear about it. So, part of it was, we were able to kind of grow. Speaking for myself, kind of able to grow without a lot of outside influences locally. I mean, we listen to records, of course, and be influenced by things, but it wasn't until, I guess, the punk rock scene and later on that you started to realize, oh wow, there's a whole bunch of freaks out there. But early on, there weren't clubs you could go to, or sometimes galleries were the only place we would play, and so we were sort of more connected to the art scene than the music scene, and then a lot of times they'd shut the power off on us, or unplug us, or the power would go off because we blew the circuit. So, but I don't know. I mean, that's one thing about LA is that it's so spread out, and there's these little, little people doing things out there. But back then, they didn't hear about it that often.
Well, Rick and I were both just barely through our teens when we fell into this whole thing, and I started playing improvised music mainly because I was playing instruments I really didn't know how to play since I was about maybe 14, and thought it was an isolated thing, and thought that there was probably nobody else anywhere that was doing this, and certainly nobody really wanted to hear it. But through Booga, it seemed at that time there were whole pockets of people doing this, kind of scattered around, independent, not knowing there were others doing it. And through Booga, is how we kind of all met each other and realized that we were doing something similar. So I think pre-internet, it was kind of a chance operation to have this thing happen, but we did make the connections and became something. Strength in numbers mostly, like we say, there wasn't many places to play, but we figured if there were enough of us, we'd be able to make something happen. Sometimes it happened.
Well, we were doing this before there was an LA Weekly or, certainly the internet or anything. So the way we got the word out was by making flyers. And if you look in the book, you'll see there's a huge wall of flyers because we did a lot of shows. And each of us as members would each design their own flyer and take it out to whatever resources we thought we could fish people into showing up. And surprisingly, we got pretty big audiences every time we performed. But it was as grassroots as you can get. I mean, in terms of LA, the only places you could go see experimental music or new music was UCLA, USC, or the Theater Vanguard on Little Santa Monica Boulevard. Occasionally, people would develop programs and bring in free improvisers from Europe or England, and we'd all show up there. There's Tony Mostrom over there, and I used to see him at every show, you know, everywhere, and then we became friends and colleagues and radio partners and gay lovers. No, I'm kidding. But we're still friends, and you know, that's how it happened. You know, I got to know Paul, Joe, Rick, Ace, and Dennis through Poobahs. I was the import buyer, so I would bring in all these weird records, and they'd come in and I'd say, you gotta buy this. You gotta hear this, because this is unbelievable. And then that kept growing and growing, and more people would come in, and I'd make them buy it. And I mean, I could sell 30 copies of some of the weirdest music on the planet, and it was just by communicating and talking to people about it, and then my knowledge grew about it, and then I started reaching out to composers and improvisers throughout the world. They were also reaching out to us because of our records, but I traveled to England and met the whole British improvisation scene over there that was largely affiliated with Brian Eno's Obscure label, and you know, they became lifelong friends and colleagues and collaborators. And in fact, David Toop, who is now a music scholar and composer and improviser, is always playing with extended organ when we play in Europe, or we just played Ghent last year. And so you know, that's how you did it back in those days. You didn't send somebody an email. You went out and you made contact with people, and they gave you your record, they gave you their records, and you gave them your records, and you know, you corresponded through the mail. I got to know Genesis Peorage from Throbbing Gristle through writing him, and he wrote me, he hand wrote these very, very intimate letters while he was breaking up with his wife that were super long and all handwritten. This is all part of the kind of the mail art, post-Dada, you know, Fluxus methodology of making work. And that's how I saw working with sound and music making was a way to step aside from painting and the object of the art object itself. And through sound, I could reach more people through the ether, and then with the record, I could reach more people at a much lower and cheaper way than making a painting, which only went to one person and, you know, hopefully went for lots of money, but I wasn't at that point. And, you know, but through a record, I could sell it for $2.50 and get it out to 200 people, you know.
I wanted to say one thing in relationship to not having venue. There was also a very clear divide, and it brought to mind the Little Bighorn, which was Bobby Bradford's small club in Pasadena, which was supposed to be experimental. But for someone like me, I play cello, but I'm also a singer. That's primarily what I do. But I was really interested in the idea of sound. So with sound, then as a singer, you get stuck with words. And so the Little Bighorn was a great place to hear experimental, new jazz people, but it was still in the context of traditional instruments. So you had someone who played a trap set, you had someone who played a saxophone. You didn't have this. This would not be instruments, you know. You would have regular stuff, you know, that looked like it could be played anywhere if it was an instrument. So the draw of having a place where this would be instruments, you know, that was huge for me, because there was the outer limits of the jazz scene, but it was over here, and it wasn't this, you know, it wasn't this. So this was what was interesting for me, and so Bobby Bradford was around at that time, had a club, but he would never have had this particular configuration because it was still too outside for the outside jazz players. So I was going, but wait, so this was a different scene.
Well, the venues were very unconventional, right? For the early,
They were what?
The venues were very unconventional for early performances, right? The Brand Library and
Yeah. But we weren't, you know, we weren't academic in the music world, so we couldn't fit in with the contemporary classical world, and we didn't have the chops of a jazz player, and they were even though they were playing free jazz, they had incredibly narrow minds, and you know, I mean, all of those doors are opening now a little bit more, but back then, you know, if I did this, you know, it just wasn't, you know, in a group context, it wasn't valued unless it was like, you know, through charts and, you know, or Zappa or stuff like that. I mean, it was, the whole idea of music making was much more conservative then.
And one thing is that a lot of us grew up in the sleepy San Gabriel Valley, and a lot of us are baby boomers, and at that time, you know, there wasn't much to entertain us, and there were hordes of kids, so you know, we started doing like the Little Rascals thing. Hey kids, let's put on a show. And I think a lot of the LAFMS aesthetic comes from that, and I think that's why we thought, hey, you know, we can be a sound organization. Hey, we can put out records. It comes from that background of entertaining ourselves, you know, in the super smoggy summers, you know, in the San Gabriel Valley.
so with the LAFMS core groups, at least in my understanding, there's all these sort of ad hoc configurations of people that come together and split apart, and you know, some projects are just for the duration of a single recording, but there are also groups that have had a longer life that are more or less stable. Could you talk about the identities of those groups? Did they come out of ideas? Did they come out of a collection of instruments? Are they just determined by who the personnel are? Like,
Many different answers for those questions. I think there's many different answers as there are groupings.
Like you mentioned, that some of them were groups that were formed by whoever happened to show up that day for the recording session. Other ones, for whatever reason, you know, they became more intensive collections. I don't know, sometimes it seemed to have to do with proximity. Le Forte Force started because basically Joe was giving Chip Chapman rides back out to CalArts on Sunday night, where he had studio time for a few hours on Sunday nights in the electronic music studios, and I started tagging along and we started making recordings there. So that was became sort of a ritual where every week Chip would come down for the weekend, then on Sunday night Joe and I would drive him back up there and make tapes, and then you sort of, I guess we developed sort of an aesthetic from doing that, just from things that we liked as we were working, and developed more of an identity than the groups where, yeah, we liked that recording, but, you know, we really didn't think we could be, each person be in 5 different bands at the same time. It was, we had like our main groups that we were in, but then we'd get together and play and make recordings and then just come up with a name. So that's where a lot of the confusion comes from.
Yeah, the groups were pretty open-ended, and like Rick would have an idea for a song, and he'd say, "Hey, I want to record the song," and then invite some of us over to play, and then Dennis had a song, and he told us what it is, would show us what it is, and then little by little we'd add stuff onto it, and then that became Dennis Duck and the Fine Arts Dumpsters, or the Rick Potts Band, or
Early on, we had tried to play rock music, and it turned out to be a bummer, and it didn't sound good, and we just got in big arguments. So going up to Cal Arts with Chip, there was this incredible freedom, and then one day he said, "Oh, I came up with a name for our band," and I panicked because I thought it's going to ruin it. We're going to try to be something now. And so at first I was really like, I didn't think I said anything, but I was just like, oh no, a band, it's going to be horrible. But, we just took the name and kept doing what we were doing, and so it was all right. But, I think that's why it was malleable, because it was just more fun that way than having a really strict structure for a lot of the projects.
We took any opportunity we could to do shows, to do recording situations. I was a parking lot attendant at the music center, and on my breaks, I would wear my uniform and I would go into the artist entrance at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and I'd take the elevator up to the 4th floor and go into the rehearsal rooms, and I would use the pianos or harpsichords or whatever was up there, and would just improvise. But then I realized these were really good spaces to record in, so I would go in on my days off dressed as a parking lot attendant, go in, say hi to the guards, go up to the 4th floor, walk across the walkway to the back door, go down, and let Dennis and Fred in with instruments and recording equipment, and we used the rehearsal rooms of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. So sometimes there were harpsichords there, sometimes there were drums, sometimes there were timpanis, harps, and we considered them guerrilla performances, private performances, and made lots of recordings there. So, you just grabbed any opportunity you could.
Yeah, that was a particularly exciting time because we played under the fear that we would be discovered. That door could open at any moment and a security guard would walk in, or somebody of authority. So that kind of made it more fun, I think. We just, we knew that it could be over at any second, but we never got caught. That was the great part about it. I don't know how we did that.
Well, one time somebody came and knocked on the door, and we looked at each other like, uh-oh, we've been busted. And I went and opened up the door, and they said, "Oh, sorry, we didn't know somebody was in here. We had this booked, but we can go to this other one over here." And
I forgot about that.
I said, "Okay, great, fine, thanks." And we just went back to doing our work.
Good one.
Another thing about the various mixtures of the core people with different bands is as the different ensembles established themselves or recorded or performed, and we would have, what would you call them, jam sessions with others of us, not working under the same roof, then new bands came of it because of the variety of pairings or groupings. Or, for example, recently we have Daft. I've played with Dennis for years and Fredrik, but not as a trio. Or the Hanger Quartet, which is Rick and Dennis and Vetza and I. And we were thrown together for a show, and it just, this felt good. Let's do it again. So some of the groups have come from just the idea that mixing us and reshuffling our deck comes up with a new approach to what we're doing, or a different angle. So that's how a lot of that happens too.
But I mean, within all of these different groups, there's lots of methodologies that we individually explore and bring to the collective. I mean, you know, I did a lot of homemade instruments and invented sounds, and you know, people would play with toys, and you know, we were always exploring new sound sources: tape, radio, drums, percussion. Anything that made sound was up for grabs.
Well, and you made your own instruments too, in many cases.
Yeah. I was inventing instruments at the beginning. Yeah.
Can you tell us about some of them?
One of them was an instrument called the mock cello, which was a 2x4 with a resonator box on it, and it was one string. The cello was my favorite instrument, and I really wanted to play the cello, but I wasn't disciplined enough to learn how to do it. So I made myself this one string cello that was held together by tension, and as you played it, it would occasionally and most always fall apart. There was the nail shoe, which were these shoes that attached to my body that had nails on them, and I would use them to scratch and scrape on the floor. I was interested in finding or discovering sounds that could be generated by small movements of my body, you know, and but could make pretty powerful sounds. There was the strungophone, which was a 2x4 with a inverted cymbal on top of it, played with the string stretched over the cymbal and played in a particular way that created this gigantic drone, and there were a ton of others.
I was thinking, you know, there's this thing where you try to find, you know, this from a historical point of view, or the point of view of, did this originate, or where did it originate out of? And there were a couple of things that sort of struck me. One was when Joe just said Spanky and our gang, which sets up a different type of impetus for what might have happened, and that is just a group of people got together and started making sounds or music. And as an image, Spanky and our gang kind of suits this core group as they were coming out of high school or going into college, right? So, because it goes back that far. I think there's this thing of, I've always kind of thought of the LAFMS as a porch band and not as a garage band. And the impetus that it's never going to really, and you're not looking for success, you're really looking for what happens within improvisation. And the notion of improvisation in the late 60s and 70s that was part of music and dance and, you know, and I think, and then you have Fluxus, and you have the scratch orchestra, or you have these things where making instruments and everyday sound like John Cage, and all this is going on, and using tape recorders, and it's all happening in the 60s. And then an improvisation, and in the notion of a collective, which I think is really kind of critical at that period, this thing of whether it's the commune collective or the collective, and the idea that you would form a collective, the idea that you weren't looking to be successful within any arena like art or music, and improvisation. And then 40 years later, it's the same. It's still an improvisational group. It's still a collective, and no one is making any money off of it. So it never did, as a garage band might become successful. As a porch band, you're just simply making the music because you want, or making the sound. And I was thinking that at the time for me in the 60s of making sound pieces, I was part of a group in which the lead singer was a rooster that was on the shoulders of someone, and I played tapes, and there were 4 women who sang nursery rhymes, and we basically played in jazz festivals. And we were always like seeing, well, we'll not be back next year. And but it was like going into, this idea of sort of subverting the jazz festival, or subverting, like going into an arena and subverting it. And also the concept of play, collective improvisation, play, and art as life, and only doing it because of you want to make the music. And then you kind of look and say, wow, it's kind of crazy, this group sort of, and it's not a group per se, it's like some sort of collective band has managed to stay together and continue for the reasons that playing together is interesting.
These were the days, too, when object making was kind of frowned upon in the art world, and people were trying to connect art with everyday life and get art off the wall and into the space of life, for lack of a better word.
And not making objects for political reasons.
Yeah.
And I think you said, like, making gestures with your body. Well, the whole thing of the sculpture and the body, or the body in performance, had been so much a part. It was part of the art world. You had Terry Fox like dragging a shovel, or then you had Charlemagne Palestine more in the music arena, but rolling on the floor. And I think I remember Charlemagne doing that at Cal Arts. He rolled across the floor singing, and probably 1970, I guess. I don't know. And he was in the music department, as I recall. He wasn't in the art department.
Do you see a connection there with the sense of humor? It seems like a garage band is trying really hard to be cool, whereas maybe a collective of porch musicians, there's more of a space for.
Well, there's more of a space. You don't have to say it ends in such and such a time. It could go on for 5-6 hours, And I think humor's a side thing to the LAFMS. It's really part of the LAFMS. Like dumbness is, dumbness goes right along with it. Like, intentional dumbness. I think there's this thing of, I never thought of the LAFMS as freak culture or nerd culture, like in punk or something, or hip culture. It really adopted a kind of genuine, like, I don't know, childlike almost,
There was a sense of exploration, or exploring humor in free improvised music out of Europe. There were plenty of performers who would, jump off their drum kit and suddenly play their body or play their feet. And those were the kinds of humor I was riffing off of more than, Frank Zappa or something, freak culture.
There was also that kind of neo-Dada scene from Canada and San Francisco and Seattle that the Residents were part of. And for like Forte 4, I think that's where it was more like allowing humor, letting us do that if we felt
not being
like
afraid of it.
Yeah, and it was coming through mail art was where, but then there was File magazine and some other elements that we were picking up on that, and I think that's one of the reasons why, I mean, it came naturally, but we were like, oh, it's okay to be silly.
But what's remarkable about the group, and that it's the fact that it has lasted as long as it has, but it's always been a free-flowing workshop for any of us to go in any direction that we want to go. And I always have these people to support me in that, you know, and that's pretty remarkable going on 45 years, you know. It's and they certainly call in the troops whenever they need us as well. But, you know, LAFMS shows would suddenly happen, and it was like, well, hey, Joe booked a show on the West Side. It's happening tonight. Can you make it? And, oh, okay, sure, we'll show up, you know. Or it was when you try to define it, it kind of slips away from you. Because it can go in any direction possible, which is a great thing.
It also seems, you know, music like this has always kind of existed, like somebody's pounded on a tree or pounded on their door, so there's that. I mean, I was kind of thinking, I was just trying to remember something I saw, the musician Roland Kerr, the free jazz musician, and I remember on Soul Train, they had him on Soul Train, and it was, I don't know, early 70s, or I think early 70s, and he was playing, they put him on a little stage that it was so fucked up, like a 6-foot circle about a foot off the ground, and he sat in a chair and he was playing 2 or 3 saxophones, and halfway through, he's blind, and halfway through he gets up, quits playing, and tries to tear his chair apart. And he keeps ripping the chair, and of course it's banging into the microphone, and I remember thinking, wow, that's one of the most fucking amazing things I've seen. Like, it totally went from Soul Train, I'm a jazz guy, to tearing his chair apart, and he started pounding the chair. And it is where I think interesting, you know, a well-known free jazz player destroys his chair on Soul Train. It was really great.
Well, I think this is probably a good place to end. There are box sets for sale, and the members of LAFMS will be around if you want to get them signed. Is there a question? Is there a question from the audience? I don't think we're going to do that, but everybody's going to be around afterwards if you want to talk to them. All right.
Thank you all for coming and not shopping on your last weekend before Christmas.